Chapter 3. The wheel in the sky keeps on turning. Colonel, it's standard operating protocol for the front door to be wide fucking open during a power outage. Stand fast, the lieutenant colonel ordered the squadron. The lieutenant colonel took a deep breath and indignantly holstered his sidearm. The sound of his sidearm rubbing against his damp leather holster made a loud squish. The signs of exasperation followed the colonel, like Punxsutawney Phil seeing his own shadow. The colonel outstretched his arms and put his hands behind his head, like a prisoner about to be handcuffed for the crime he didn't commit. He walked over to Mike Allen. The men noticed his lackadaisical attitude and had no taste for it. The men slowly looked over at the entrance of the building 257 with a sense of deliberate vigilance and exacting curiosity. The men stood poised and ready with guns drawn at the entrance of the building. The entrance was two double-wide sliding glass doors. One of the doors was marked exit, and the other entrance. Overlapping circles from their tactical LED lights loosely covered the entrance of the building and dimly lit the lobby. The raindrops pummeled the men and caused their lights to flicker on and off. Sergeant Allen didn't mind a little bit of luck every now and again, but this gave him cause for pause. Should have called the fucking electric company, not a bunch of operators, Hernandez said while preparing to take a better look at the lobby with his night vision goggles. The facility was dark, and the night vision goggles were able to give him some visibility into the lobby. The men stood at the base of the entrance. Even in the middle of a typhoon, there was obvious signs of wear and tear on the building. The building was made of solid concrete and had been severely weathered by the local island conditions, and presumably lack of basic maintenance. The building itself was very foreboding. From floor to ceiling, it looked no bigger than a big box store. The outside looking in, the men could only make out a rough outline of the lobby. Something in the lobby piqued his curiosity. Was it something or someone? Sir? What? There's someone in the lobby. The men all looked at Hernandez in disbelief. They couldn't tell if he was fucking with them or telling the truth. The rest of the men activated their night vision goggles in order to verify his claim. It took a second to stabilize the goggles, but one by one, each man confirmed eyes on target. They couldn't quite make out much more than a shadowy figure lingering in the back of the lobby. Eyes on target, in the lobby, a man, unarmed by the looks of it, 50 yards. What do we do? The men looked at each other, just long enough to break sight with the target. By the time they looked back, the target had vanished from sight. Well, that was easy. Maybe next mission I won't even bring my guns, sir. Mike Allen wasn't in the business of making risky decisions. As far as he could tell, this was still a glorified training op. Sir, I'm breaching. What are my orders? DeStefano said over the comms. Mike Allen responded decisively. Breach. The men crossed the threshold from the muddy terrain in the hard concrete steps of Building 257. The building had 6 oversized concrete steps. The team infiltrated the facility's entrance, led by DeStefano in a standard 2x2 cover formation. Hernandez intuitively looked around the room for a light switch. Each team member scanned the room for survivors. Each team member scanned the room for some sign of life. Each team member scanned the room for something that wasn't there. The room had several large desks and 4 separate doors, each marked with a red neon exit sign. So, this is it? This is the big bad BSL-4 bioweapons lab? Hernandez asked the crew. Each man started investigating the inner workings of the lobby. There was an old commercial-grade carpet that made a soggy smushing sound every time someone walked on it. The combination of mud-covered military boots and old carpet made a distinctive sound, like trying to squirt out the last squeeze of the mustard dispenser. Corporal Lindell could feel his blood pressure start to wane, so he grabbed a candy bar out of the front pocket and started peeling back the wrapper. Chocolate. Good for every occasion, the corporal thought to himself. As Lindell fidgeted with the candy wrapper, it made a loud crinkling that carried throughout the lobby. The rain temporarily subsided, and the men turned around in disbelief. They had become familiar with the constant battering of raindrops and hurricane-force winds. The men took it as a sign of good fortune. From here on out, things were looking up. What's the readout looking like? Whitaker glanced over at his handy-dandy high-volume aerodynamic particle sizer. This was his first encounter with the device. On the ride over, he had a chance to peruse through the lengthy owner's manual. He gave it a second to update the reading and impatiently tapped it on the side, like an old video game cassette that wouldn't load. Particle size distribution looks completely normal. Nothing out of the ordinary as far as I can tell. That is aside from the deserted bioweapons lab. Whitaker called out to the sergeant. Mike Allen let out an enormous sigh of relief and went back to investigating the lobby of the laboratory. From this point on, respirators and hazmat suits on. I'm still not 100% convinced anything actually happened here. First objective is to find Dr. Carrington. If we beat Bravo team to the objective, drinks are on me tonight, Sergeant Allen spouted to the men. One by one, the men dropped their gear bags and began to suit up. The hazmat suits made a crunching sound like the crinkling of a potato chip bag. Meanwhile, on the upper deck, Sergeant Miller led Bravo team into the corridors of the top floor of Building 257. The sound of gunshot snapped his instincts into full gear. Kill switch engaged. The young staff sergeant had a chip on his shoulder and was eager to climb the chain of command. The easiest way to do that was putting the pedal to the metal and find Dr. Carrington before the Alpha team. Sir, I recommend we suit up, Barnes said affirmatively while pulling out his gear bag. The staff sergeant stopped dead in his tracks. The rest of the team abruptly halted their vigorous progress towards the sound. What's the readout? The staff sergeant inquired, his tone of voice deliberate, as if he wanted to undermine the medical sergeant's advice. Corporal Barnes was unfazed and would not let a cavalier superior officer deter his sound medical advice. Readout is normal. No biohazard detected, Corporal Barnes read aloud from the high-volume aerodynamic particle. Unfortunately for the team, this only reaffirmed the staff sergeant's suspicions about the veracity of the mission. As far as he could tell, he was a disgruntled employee with a gun or a blown circuit breaker. Men, as far as I could tell, this is probably just another case of workplace violence. We have overwatch and the element of surprise. Every second we waste up here is 1 second less we have to take the initiative. We are to proceed on mission and take the objective. Move out. Sir, Barnes whimpered in pathetic protest. The staff sergeant swiveled his head around on his axis, like someone spinning a globe for the first time. The staff sergeant glared at the medical sergeant with an indignant, intimidating, intense look on his face. The staff sergeant's patience was wearing thin, and it showed on his face. His forehead was swelling with a blood-red hue like a ripened tomato ready to be plucked from the vine. There was a vein thumping and extruding from his neck. Every second we stand here, one less potential hostage and one more potential body bag. We're moving out, the staff sergeant said in a disparaging tone. The medical sergeant had a choice to make. On one hand, he could continue his protest. On the other hand, he could just in line and follow his orders. The medical sergeant was old school. He often chose the path of most resistance. To his own detriment, he often chose the path of learning the hard way. He often chose the path that prevented him from climbing the ranks. For once, the medical sergeant chose to let cooler heads prevail and follow orders. Aye, sir. Yes, sir. The medical sergeant's momentary hesitation increased the heightened state of awareness adorned by the rest of the squad. The medical sergeant slugged his rifle and unholstered his sidearm. He held his M9 Beretta out with his right hand and the high-volume aerodynamic particle in his left hand. The medical sergeant began to purposely show his pace like a marathon runner trying to catch a second wind. He steadily fell behind the squad. Barnes had garnered no favor with the squad by voicing his concerns. The hallways had no real rhyme or reason to the design. The men traversed a labyrinth of long, thin corridors with near 20-foot ceilings. The tile floor occasionally glistened as the beams of LED-mounted flashlights hit the ground. The men covered the hallway with their M4 carbines. Each man moved in a straight line and slowly scanned the room. The military was like that, full of rigorous and repeatable processes to follow. Those who followed the processes the best tended to get promoted the fastest. The men hastened the search and began to increasingly pull away from the medical sergeant. At this point, the men had penetrated deep into the facility. At this point, them men had not seen a single soul. At this point, this was starting to feel like a wild goose chase. Room by room, the squad cleared the upper deck of the facility. No guns, no germs, no one to be found. The staff sergeant stood in the center of one of the cleared-out rooms with his hands tucked under his armpits. The normal protocol for this sort of situation would be to radio the command with a sit rep. No sign of Dr. Carrington. She's probably in the basement attempting to get the reactor back on, the staff sergeant explained logically. To the young sergeant, the simplest answers tended to be the most correct answers. The world wasn't some mystifying confound. Life was as simple as lead, follow, or get out of the way. Sir. What is it, Yamada? Shouldn't we radio sit rep into headquarters? This isn't a fucking democracy, Yamada. Clang, clang, clang. The sergeant yelled to the team. Listen up! The squad pivoted towards the noise with guns drawn towards the hallway adjacent to the room. There was a door off-center across from the open door of the room. Something was making noise on the other side. The sign above the door read, Stairwell. The door signs flickered, using what last ounces of emergency power they could latch onto. The men slowly exited the room and surrounded the door of the hallway. This was it. Time to turn it up. Sergeant Miller pulled out a wrecking bar and handed it over to Yamada. He plunged the wrecking bar into the door jamb. He obstructed the line of fire for the other men, so they held up their rifles. Subsequently, this took all the light off the breaching point. The corporal used all of his strength and pried the door open with his wrecking bar. The men quickly pointed their rifles back at the door to identify and engage any possible threat. Whoa, don't shoot, friendly, a man said while holding his forearms up to shield his eyes from the bright light of the LED flashlights pointed in his face. Identify yourself, Staff Sergeant Miller hollered at the unknown man. Don't shoot, don't. I'm one of the fishermen. We washed up on shore during the hurricane. What a GD nightmare, he said. The sergeant stepped up to the man and ripped his forearm down from his face. He wanted to get a better look and see who was he dealing with. The sergeant took a quick minute and sized him up. At first glance, he seemed like one of the fishermen. He had mangy hair, an unkempt beard, and looked seaworthy. What the fuck are you doing pounding on the door like that? The doors have been automatic locking mechanisms from inside. I ran up the stairs once I heard you guys, and I just tried to call for help. That doesn't explain what you're doing up here by your lonesome. Start talking. Sergeant Miller ordered the man. Miller was wet behind the ears, but didn't lack a sense of paranoia and cunning. What am I? The man stuttered stupendously. Miller wanted to cut right to the point. He was a man on a mission, and this guy was only wasting his time. Where's Dr. Carrington? He asked while shining his light back in the man's face. Instinctively, the man raised his hand up to block the light from obstructing his view. Oh, Dr. Carrington, yeah. She's down in the basement with everyone else, trying to get the power back on or something. It's all a little above my pay grade, you know, he explained in a soft tone. The squad nestled their firearms away for the moment. This all seemed to be a run-of-the-mill power outage. Miller's earlier suspicions were confirmed, and he was more eager than ever to link up with Dr. Carrington. Who are you guys? Are you here to help with the power outage, or? We're the cavalry, son. Don't get in our way, and you won't have a problem, Miller said while shoving the beleaguered fisherman to the side of the stairwell. Miller shoved the fisherman aside like a varsity football jock, shoving his way through an overcrowded locker room of freshmen. Sure thing. I'm just glad you're here. Follow me. I'll show you the way to the basement, he said as he stuck his arm out. He looked more like a doorman at a fancy hotel lobby rather than a shipwrecked fisherman. The sergeant paused for a moment and stuck his head over the railing to get a better look down the stairwell. He grabbed half a dozen glow sticks out of his pocket and started activating them one at a time. Every time he cracked a glow stick, he shook it and tossed it down the stairwell. The green neon light began to illuminate the once pitch-black stairwell. Meanwhile, inside the main facility from the ground floor level. Sir, we've got a survivor here by the looks of it, Hernandez said and pointed his flashlight over at a body on the floor. Mike swiveled his rifle and pointed it in the direction of one of the survivors. Mike was perplexed. He couldn't figure out if the survivor was a friend or foe. From the looks of it, the survivor was part of a fishing crew that would wash ashore. Lindell slowly approached the survivor to assess the damage. He often acted on pure instinct like a mama bear looking for her cubs. Lindell checked for a pulse, flipped over the limp body, and placed his ear on the chest of the survivor. After about 10 seconds of silence, a smirk gleamed across Lindell's face. He raised his hand and shot the crew with a thumbs up. Lindell rolled up the sleeve of the survivor to find a spot to inject an adrenaline syringe. As he began to roll back the sleeve, he spotted something. Something he hadn't seen in quite some time. "You've got to be shitting me," he said under his breath. The team looked over curious at Lindell's statement. Lindell wasn't much for profanity, nor hyperbole. When he partook in a colorful language, the men noticed. "What is it?" Mike questioned him. "Look for yourself," he said, holding up the left wrist of the survivor. Mike examined the pale arm of the survivor, only to see a large blackened skull, adorned with a green beret and a bayonet knife. "Interesting. What is it, Sarge?" "Looks like we have a former special operator here. Green beret from the looks of it." "So the plot thickens," Sergeant Allen said suggestively. Mike Allen uncomfortably coughed through his respirator. He instinctively raised his hand in order to cover the cough. The retired colonel finally decided to chime in. "Sergeant, the new CDC recommended protocol for covering a cough or a sneeze is to use your elbow, not your hand." "Yeah, Sarge, get with the times," Hernandez said jokingly. The squad looked over at the retired colonel with a significant level of incertitude. Hernandez buddied up with Stefano and whispered, "Is this guy for real? What a fucking dweeb." Stefano shrugged off the comment and went back to scanning the hallway. Whitaker slowly walked over to Sergeant Allen's position. His boots made loud thuds as he walked down the hallway. It sounded like someone serving a tennis ball at 100 miles per hour. "Does this mean anything to you?" Whitaker asked the intelligence officer suspiciously. He looked the intelligence officer dead in the eyes. Whitaker wanted to gauge his honest reaction, even if it was from behind a face shield and a respirator. Whitaker wasn't a beat around the bush kind of guy. He focused crisply in on the colonel's state of mind like a dog staring at a bowl of food. "No, I can't say that it does." "Can't or won't?" Whitaker replied to a wishy-washy answer. The intelligence officer wasn't amused by Whitaker's snarky disposition. He wasn't aching to being challenged or second-guessed. "Do I have to pull rank, sailor?" That chicken shit kind of response gave Whitaker enough gusto to muscle up on the colonel. Whitaker smiled and said, "Look, I don't care who you were years ago, or who you are now, or whose nephew you used to be." The crew was stunned by his words. Occasionally, everyone popped off, but rarely, if ever, did anyone accept that to come from the ever-cool, calm, and collected Whitaker. The tension in the room was as thick as freshly churned Irish butter. "Gentlemen, please. Why don't we just ask our sleeping beauty over here?" "Gentlemen, please. Why don't we just ask our sleeping beauty over here?" Lindell said as he plunged the adrenaline needle into the arm of the mercenary. Lindell emptied the contents of the syringe into the forearm of the mercenary. It took almost instant effect, and the mercenary slowly regained consciousness. Sergeant Allen knelt down to meet the mercenary at eye level. The mercenary had barely begun to wake when a large snarl rang out. It was followed by the calamity of what could only be a firefight. The sergeant hopped up from a kneeling position and pulled his sidearm out. He scanned both ends of the hallway. The men sprang into action, ready for a skirmish. The men couldn't make heads or tails of the direction of fire. Was it above or below? Was it behind or in front? The hallways were narrow and tall, which made for the perfect processionary confusion. Clack, clack, clack! "Who fired their weapon? Give me a status." To the chagrin of the sergeant, no answer came across the comms. The room was as silent as the library on Sunday afternoon. Clack, clack, clack! "Who engaged? Does anyone have eyes on target?" The sergeant's questions lingered unanswered as the squad covered both ends of the hallway and attempted to determine the source of the gunshots. The team was attentive as a dog trying to follow a laser pointer. "It's Bravo team, sir," the gunnery sergeant answered. It was a familiar sound that the entire squad was able to easily recognize. Nothing else had such a robust, distinctive sound than a 5.56 45mm NATO. air-cooled, gas-operated, direct impingement, magazine-fed, select-fire M4 carbine. Sir. Hernandez, get on the comms and figure out what the fuck is going on to Bravo team. Sir. What? Sir, we need to pursue. Whitaker spoke up with an inquisitiveness of a child discovering caffeine for the first time. He knew with each passing moment the odds of successfully interceding diminished exponentially. Negative, sailor. Delay that order, the intelligence officer said from across the room. The crew looked over at the intelligence officer in a furious disbelief in his cowardice. Bravo team could be on any level of this facility, and we cannot risk a firefight. Our objective is to find Dr. Kerrigan and turn the reactor back on. We need to restore power ASAP. For now, Bravo team is on their own. DeStefano slugged his rifle over his shoulder, pulled his combat knife from his boot, and charged the intelligence officer, to which the intelligence officer pulled his sidearm and racked the back slide. It did not have the intended effect of intimidating the gunnery sergeant. The intelligence officer prudently holstered his weapon and said something that halted DeStefano dead in his tracks. If we don't get the reactor back online, the building will collapse on itself. Clack, clack, clack. The men were completely unfazed by the sounds of their comrades, most likely engaged by hostiles. The words of the intelligence officer obscured any intention or vigilance left in the squad. DeStefano sheathed his knife and folded his arms in protest. I thought that was only a failsafe, Allen said. How do you think the failsafe is triggered? By this very fucking scenario. Why do you think the front door was open? The colonel said in an admonishing tone of voice. How much time do we have? DeStefano asked the colonel. We have 2 hours max if we're lucky. 2.5. Bravo team, come in. Bravo team, come in. Hernandez continued his attempt to hail the Bravo team over the comm line. Clack, clack, clack. Hernandez was helplessly fidgeting with his radio and failed to reach the other squadron of men. The thick steel and concrete of the building obscured the radios. The radios were about as effective as using a Chinese finger trap as a condom. Sergeant, Hernandez shouted. What? To everyone's delight, a scrambled transmission muttered across the radio. Alpha team, this is Sergeant Miller. Come in. Sergeant Miller pleaded over a broken communication relay. Copy that. We heard gunfire, over. The sergeant said over a garbled transmission. Repeat, Bravo team, repeat. Come in. Shit, Hernandez shouted over the comm line. We've reached sub-basement level 1 via the main stairwell, over, he said as the transmission waned in and out of favor. Copy that. What are we up against? Over, Hernandez pleaded with the staff sergeant. We found a lone survivor from the fishing boat. Son of a bitch jabbed me with something, a fucking syringe full of God knows what. Little shit retreated into the biolab, he said while heavily breathing. Status report. We lost Barnes in the commotion, but I think we managed to wound the bastard in the process, over, he said with bated breath. The sergeant's voice was becoming somewhat erratic. Hernandez held the speaker up for the rest of the team to listen. The squad was tuned in to the fleeting conversation. Each man stared with a tunnel vision at the headset as the staff sergeant screamed bloody murder over the microphone. Yeah, we tagged him all right. There's a trail of blood. We're in pursuit. Over and out. The sergeant shouted through a comm like hound picking up the trail of hair. Meanwhile, in the upstairs level of the building, Corporal Barnes had thought it prudent to fully suit up. He intentionally fell back as the squad proceeded further to the bioweapons lab to chase the fisherman. Just as Barnes finished suiting up, he heard a rustling sound, like the scurrying of a rat running across the floor. He pulled the muzzle of his rifle to the corner of the room and shined a light in the direction of the noise. To his surprise, nothing was there. To his surprise, nothing was afoot. To his surprise, nothing was out of the ordinary. I got to get out of this fucking place, he said aloud to an empty room. Barnes, can you read me? Sergeant Miller shouted over the Bravo team's comm line. Barnes thought it best to sit back and let his squad leader do all the heavy lifting. No matter how uncharacteristic of Barnes, he felt that the sergeant was on a collision course with getting everyone killed or worse. Accidentally unleashing a bioweapon from the lab, Barnes turned off his radio and transmitter. From this point out, he was on his own or would link up with Alpha Team. Barnes began to follow the trail of the tears left behind by his comrades in arms. As he progressed deeper into the facility, he marked his position by drawing a big smiley face on the wall with a luminescent paint that he kept handy. It easily showed up on his night vision goggles. As he was marking a wall next to him, another scurrying sound rushed by the adjacent unmarked hallway. He swiveled his head and turned his zen forward towards the open door. "Who's there?" Barnes dished the heroic bullshit and bravado from his earlier protest. He turned his radio back on with his left hand and held his rifle with his right. The light was shaking up and down. He fumbled about trying to multitask or calm his nerves enough to steady the rifle. "Sergeant, this is Barnes. Do you copy?" The sergeant did not respond to his plea. He was met with unyielding silence. "Anyone on this channel? Do you copy?" "Barnes, this is Alpha Team. We read you loud and clear, over," Hernandez responded affirmatively. "Whew! I thought one of you fuckers was up here messing with me," Barnes said in relief. He momentarily could relax and shake off his intolerable sense of anxiety. His respirator was fogging up and obscuring his vision. He decided to remove it and take a second to reset. He dropped his gun and began to remove his respirator. "I'm on my way to you," he said, followed by an inaudible screeching and static noise. "Barnes, do you copy?" Hernandez pleases with his comrade. "Fuck, why are these comps so unreliable?" Hernandez shouted. Sergeant Allen was somewhat flustered with the lack of progress and lack of communication. "Whitaker, front and center." "Sir." "Grab our guest and follow me," he said. The time for indecision had passed. The time for playing it by the book had passed. The time for not making choices had passed. The sergeant racked his rifle, pointed it forward down the hallway. Whitaker grabbed the wounded fisherman by the arm and swung the near lifeless body over his shoulder. Whitaker was large enough to hold his rifle in one hand and manage the survivor with the other. The men swept the first floor of the building and headed towards Corporal Barnes, or at least where they thought he was.